everyone, Cassius here, welcoming you back to the Shakespeare Minute. I'm here today to talk about Shakespeare themes, the late plays. First, let's talk a little bit about the late plays generally. Much like the Beatles, Shakespeare had a career trajectory that started with the crowd-pleasing, fun, lighter material, like the flag-waving histories, the uber-violent tragedies, and the off-the-wall mistaken identity comedies. He then transitioned to the more mature, best-of-the-medium material, like the Big Four tragedies, the middle comedies, and then went gleefully into the what on earth is he on territory. For the Beatles, of course, that latter part of their career is often considered the best by people who enjoy particularly drug-fueled music. And me. But for Shakespeare, these are called the late plays and inspire quite a bit of confusion, generally comprised of The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, Cymbeline, Pericles, and Two Noble Kinsmen, and of course sometimes Henry VIII, which is typically classified as a history though. These plays are definitely the magical mystery tour of Shakespeare, but are they as downright awesome as the magical mystery tour? Well, the plays certainly have their own charm, and they defy other genre description, for the most part anyway. Are these plays tragedies? They often feature a fair bit of death and destruction. Are they comedies? There's typically a lot of marriage, and those are the two things that you tend to look for when you're deciding is a play a tragedy or a comedy. But if you have marriages and betrothals and also a lot of death and destruction, what in the name of Bard was Shakespeare going for? And what does he do in the late plays that he really doesn't do up to this point? The most common answer to that question is that later in his career, Shakespeare started writing not comedies or tragedies, but fairy tales. And the supernatural, wondrous elements of those kinds of stories do tend to be here. Sweeping plot developments, insane contrivances, and ancient gods popping up to our hero's aid. What on earth? So let's take a look at the recurring fairy tale world plot points for these late plays, for those of you who might be unfamiliar. First off, you can't have a late play without sea voyages, and even better, shipwrecks. Well, of course, these aren't unheard of in the earlier plays. They come in full force here. The Tempest and Pericles are the clear winners, with the Tempest getting its name from a shipwrecking act of wizard, and Pericles being about 80% sea voyage and 50% shipwreck. This guy, Pericles, gets wrecked more often than frat boys at a power hour. Cymbeline, Two Noble Kinsmen, and The Winter's Tale don't feature shipwrecks per se, but The Winter's Tale does feature several sea voyages between Bohemia and Sicilia. Do not take time to see if that makes sense geographically. Shakespeare didn't. And even the other plays show long travels, often fraught with peril. The idea of building a big, sprawling wonder of a world is key, and Shakespeare does it eloquently as per usual. The second thing that he features in the late plays more often than the earlier works is visitations from gods. My goodness, is this surprisingly common. While dreams, madness, and dead people are fairly common among the more traditional earlier Shakespeare work, only later do you start seeing him play with actual deities. The Winter's Tale seems to be the only exception here, and even in that play an oracle is consulted and returns with the word of Apollo. Cymbeline, the play, has Jupiter himself come to the aid of one very confused, tormented death row prisoner. Pericles shows Diana appearing to the title character to show him where to find his wife, so he can wrap up Act 5, you see. And Two Noble Kinsmen has a bunch of supernatural visitations from various deities, Mars and Venus, to name a few, to soldiers before a one-on-one fight. The Tempest features Prospero's magic minions, as well as a mask where he presents many Greek goddesses to his daughter and her fiancé. Again, we're talking about a world of wonder where people can be led by these fantastical elements. It's not woven in to be like a realistic part of their world, but rather to be this visitation and to get this magical realism kind of vibe going. And thirdly, in a late play, as I mentioned, you ought to really have at least one death and at least one marriage/betrothal for the ultimate genre-bending experience. And this is where these plays are typically called romances instead of comedies or tragedies, because they get really dark, but they have a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. The Winter's Tale, ends with, the young people in this pastoral romance plot. So a comedy, right? Well, not so much. Leontes, the king, ends up inadvertently killing two minor characters. Whoops. Cymbeline is a very good Disney movie in that it deals with the bad guys in the way a Disney movie tends to, and of course there is some marriage in there as well. Pericles features, like Cymbeline, we deal with the bad guys the way a Disney movie might do, but they're incestuous, scary people, so that's a little less Disney, and of course there is marriage there as well. Two Noble Kinsmen is a little bit darker and weirder, okay, it's a lot weirder, in that a major good guy ends up in the crosshairs, but I won't spoil who it is. There are several people who are major good guys, just in case you have the burning desire to read it unspoiled, but of course, again, marriage, marriage, marriage. Only the Tempest avoids the death card completely. Nice. So if there's one thing about the late plays that sort of summarizes this, it's that they are bizarre as hell. For me, Cymbeline's the best at weaving together its four, count 'em, four plot lines into something coherent, while the other plays, especially Two Noble Kinsmen, are very difficult to wrap my head around. Cymbeline has the advantage over the others of having a few key major characters who are very sympathetic and compelling out of the mold of some of his more traditional stuff, so you get a really good foothold even as all the craziness starts to happen. The Winter's Tale stars a family annihilator who's kind of hard to love. Two Noble Kinsmen have two hard to distinguish men starring in plot twists you could get whiplash from, and Pericles is the story of one guy suffering for very little reason in a sprawlingly insane play that goes from location to location while making less sense the longer you watch. And The Tempest is, of course, basically a dream. I mean, this is what the play says, life is a dream, and that's how it feels. It doesn't have that same grounding that a play like Cymbeline kind of does. Ultimately, as you might guess, I do prefer the straight tragedies and histories, and even the comedies, to these. Although, the beauty of the late plays and their world is a wonder and appealing in its own right, in a very different way. In all seriousness, one major feature of these plays, as recently highlighted by Tyler Moss of the Shakespeare Forum on Twitter, is forgiveness. Unlike the comedies, where characters realize they never were really wronged, or tragedies where the wrongs are avenged in blood, the late plays feature people suffering incredible, legitimate wrongs and then forgiving. The Tempest features the greatest and most explicit example of this, where Prospero actually, in a distinct, explicit act of forgiveness, goes to his brother, the still pretty evil Antonio, and absolves him of all of his crimes. Cymbeline is the most expansive example, where a father forgives a man who kidnapped his sons, and another man who plotted against his daughter. A wife forgives her husband for not believing her, and even people across armies forgive their enemies, although none of those people remain or ever truly were evil in the way that Antonio of The Tempest was. Now, The Winter's Tale, like The Tempest, features people forgiving each other for old and deep crimes. Ultimately, if you like Shakespeare and you like the genre-bending mind warps and the fairy tale kind of conceit, like if you've been a big fan of all this Snow White stuff happening lately with all the movies and the Once Upon a Time TV show, these plays are really going to be your thing. Personally, although Magical Mystery Tour is my favorite Beatles album, I will stick to favoring Shakespeare's Sergeant Pepper phase, Hamlet, etc., for now. But I definitely like to wander into the strange late material, especially when done well. When put on stage in a world that is effectively aesthetically wondrous, you really can't outdo the late plays for sheer redemption and love. For the Shakespeare Minute, I'm Cassius. Till next time, think of the world. So, is Midsummer a Hard Day's Night? I'll hammer it out.